When I was 8 years old, I identified myself as a Republican and was a strong supporter of the George W. Bush administration until he started the Iraq War, when I called him an embarrassment to humanity. My special interest at the time was G.I. Joe action figures, and I had a buzz cut. During this time, I was being inundated with talk radio, like the late great Rush Limbaugh. When I was selectively mute, at this time, I developed my inner libertarian. Through being selectively mute, I learned that nobody could make me do anything. And the sovereignty of the individual is limitless. Because no matter how hard people tried, they can't make me talk. And can't make me do anything, which was greatly informative of my views of being a sovereign individual. When I was 12 years old, I was played Tommy by The Who and started playing guitar 3 months later and became obsessed with rock and roll and music that was used for political purposes, which led me to becoming obsessed with the history of grassroots movements in the 60s. After dealing with a tumultuous amount of post-traumatic stress from a broken home and the special education system, at 16 years old, I came out as a pacifist, which I am to this very day. Nobody should have to go through what I went through. And I fight for the empowerment of people so they never have to go through what I went through. When I was 16, I started writing protest songs in the tradition of Bob Dylan. At this point, I became very influenced by the ideas of the left. By this point, I became inspired by the left in the fight against poverty and the labor movement and the defense of the welfare state. When I was 17, I saw a documentary on Nat Hentoff, which inspired me to come out as a conservative on immigration. At this time, I also became infatuated with political theory in the form of enjoying the individual freedom of Ayn Rand and the labor policy of Karl Marx. At this time, I started calling myself a socialist libertarian and a left-wing anarchist. When I was 17, after I came out as bisexual, the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage, which was one of my most proudest moments as an American. When I was 18, a new movement sprung up that claimed to be a continuation of the civil rights movement, called Black Lives Matter. I thought they were horrendous. I thought their tactics were childish and a self-fulfilling prophecy of perpetual victimhood. That was incredibly exclusionary, and I hated the Diets. And although I am a pacifist, I always supported the police department, even though I have had issues with cops for being disabled myself. When I was 19 years old, I went on a birthright trip to Israel, where I was. When I came back, I became more observant to Reconstructionist Judaism and became passionately, extremely Zionistic. my special ed school realized that I had caught the bug for political activism. My school encouraged me to go into disability rights activism. And as an ASPE fighting for special education and autism. And I did public speaking on special education. After 6 months of doing public speaking and having trouble in college, where I experienced ableism, racism, classism, and anti-Semitism, when I was 20, I met one of my greatest mentors at a high-functioning autism conference, where I networked my way into the feature film Keep the Change as a musician. But more importantly, I met and befriended a great disability rights activist named Jason Ross, who introduced me to disability studies and neurodiversity. Jason helped me network my way into the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network groups, where I met a trans woman for the first time. After working with the CUNY Coalition of Students with Disabilities and the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, I was invited when I was 21 to be trained as a disability rights activist as a part of campus inclusion program, the campus inclusion program with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, where I heard two words that would eventually lead me to walk away. These two words were white privilege. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network tried to cancel me because during the training I spoke out against wanting to shut down special education. That greatly influenced my success as a disabled person and my support for special education. In turn, my parents who served as special ed teachers, my support for functioning labels, and my support for the DSM-4, which was probably problematic because Ari Naaman was an advisor for the DSM-5. What I now know is a woke document in the disabled community. After working with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, I learned the greatest love for community is to sacrifice for the community and to take full responsibility for your community. At 22 years old, my friend and fellow disability rights activist Jason Ross invited me to meet an actual eugenicist, Allison Singer, of the Autism Science Foundation, who devotes every day to curing autism. After seeing her speak without hesitation, I am unapologetically pro-life because the human genome and neurodiversity needs to be protected at all costs, and everyone, no matter how their brain works, has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from conception. When I was 23 years old, I received a new diagnosis, gender dysphoria. In turn, the disabled community turned its back on me. When I was 23, I got involved with Asexuals New York City, where I became subject to what I know as radical gender ideology that led me to getting incredibly bad advice and doing something that is my strongest regret in my transition. walking into a lady's bathroom with a beard. I always been an admirer of the women's movement. When I was 24, I had the misfortune of going to the Philadelphia Transgender Health Conference, where I experienced anti-Semitism, racism, and classism, and ableism, in the form of critical race theory, which came to a head at an open mic, where the lineup was determined by affirmative action. And when my set came, I dedicated it to the brave workers of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and the labor movement. The people who ran it were outraged and did not believe Jews were a minority, when anti-Semitism is all too common. And the LGBT community told me I had to choose between supporting Israel and being LGBT. Wokeness in the LGBT community got worse when I went to an LGBT youth group in Nassau County that advocated for finding people for using the wrong pronoun, which I passionately believe is unconstitutional. Having dedicated safe spaces on arbitrary grounds, they were science deniers who denied biological sex and advocated for children to take sterilizing hormones. Until this point, I did not know what was going on in terms of social media, in terms of wokeness, because I could not read posts due to my dyslexia, and instead studied the history of political philosophy. By this time, I questioned the intersectionality doctrine of the Autism Self-Advocacy Network. By this time, after watching videos on trans YouTube, I found a person who changed my life by the name of Blair White. Through Blair, I fell in love with the ideas of political commentator Dave Rubin. Watching Dave Rubin helped me put the woke stuff into context, which is where I knew, as a liberal, the left did not define me. Through Dave Rubin, I began to really enjoy the commentary of Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager, despite disagreeing with them on economics and agreeing with them on race, affirmative action, and free speech. When I was 17 years old, I was convinced by a social worker that it was in my interest to tell the Social Security Administration my first lie, that I was incapable of being an independent steward of my own destiny, and that I had no friends and no travel training, and otherwise incapable of doing anything, made worse by the DSM-5 reclassification of autism. By the time I was 24, it snowballed into waiting for self-directed services in New York State. I was awarded self-directed services that turned into a cycle of dependence, when all I ever wanted was to take responsibility. Unfortunately, due to the cycle of dependence, it was deemed illegal for me to get married, or I will lose one of my only sources of income. By the time I was 25, from the ableism of the CUNY system, I successfully got accepted to SUNY Empire State College and got a certificate in writing, directing, and producing films and audio engineering and music production. By this time, through Dave Rubin, I became influenced by the ideas of Jordan Peterson, whose ideas inspired me to leave New York and move to Austin, Texas. When I was 25, I noticed at the LGBT synagogue, out of nowhere, began to become concerned to the point of they acted autistic by not wanting to touch people and became very worried about a virus. A few weeks later, everything got shut down due to the COVID pandemic. Previous to this point, when I lived on self-direction, the only time I interacted with non-disabled people was at synagogue, where I was tokenized and ignored. In a residential treatment center, I lived in lockdown conditions. This is why 3 weeks after the lockdown, I went into the psych ward hoping for help, but they were anti-Semitic, transphobic, and violated the Americans with Disabilities Act. When I got out, I was abandoned in New York City at the height of the lockdown by my own father, who left me for upstate New York. The two things that I was afraid of most was members of my community whose staff walked out on them, which left them unable to provide food for themselves. When I was told, according to the social contract, the state was obligated to take care of us, but they neglected their duties. They mandated to do and implementing practices to provide services online, which was a disgrace, because the role of a primary care staff was to be the limb that doesn't work right. My other greatest fear was what was to come for the workforce of musicians and filmmakers, that especially since I never had full access to be able to sell my music and films on the free market. By this point, I was vehemently opposed to the lockdowns, and people thought I wanted to kill people. But in reality, all I ever wanted was to live by the founding documents of this country, wherever the cost is. No two disabled people in the same service. And there's nothing scarier than government overreach, because no two disabled people use the same services, but because we are all individuals. And my own residential treatment center sent everyone home, which is dangerous because the families was in crisis, and the residential treatment centers help prevent suicide and arrest, and it was denied. Last summer, when the riots broke out, I was left alone in New York, and that mall I grew up going to was being rioted. At first, in the Democratic Party, I supported Elizabeth Warren because of her economics. But by the summer, with the lockdowns, I was going to support the Libertarian Party. But when the police officers in Atlanta had a sick out, and the party that was supposed to be the support for unions turned their back on working class police officers who were being shot in the streets, it was at this moment I decided to support the Republican Party by voting for the re-election of Donald Trump, who is the only one defending the cops on strike and wanting to reopen the country, standing for Americans on the verge of suicide because of the lockdowns. One of the ironies of my support for Trump is, on one hand, I was the least likely to vote for Trump because of being trans and being bisexual. On the other hand, I was the most likely person to vote for Trump because I'm working class and was assigned male at birth and of Eastern European descent. In the 70s, there was an accusation of punk rockers selling out when they got big. It was the Democrats who were selling out to corporations at the expense of the working class. From my point of view, the Democrats are a bunch of racists and anti-Semites who have corporations doing their dirty work. By this time, I noticed that conservatives wanted to open the country and were being censored on social media. I thought two things. The LGBT community says live authentically, which is what LGBT rights is based off of. The other thing was the history of the Prime Minister of Denmark putting on a yellow star in solidarity with Jewish people during the Holocaust. This is what inspired me to put on the MAGA hat in solidarity with those being discriminated against for their beliefs, because we should all live authentically. This is why I'm proud to be one of 26% of the LGBT community who voted for Trump, who is one of the most pro-LGBT presidents we've ever had. In December, I was given an ultimatum by the Department of Developmental Disabilities. Either I sign my life away or become homeless. So I took the risk, moving to Texas to live in the home of the free and the home of the brave. I decided to commit to voting Republican because Republicans understand restricting abortions for babies with Down syndrome that sends a message that because to the disabled community, we are all welcome and valued members of society. Ultimately, my support for the Republicans stems from sustainable governance, safe neighborhoods, and adherence to the Constitution. I still support single-payer healthcare and union rights, but I am nobody's token. I'm a fellow American who wants to build stronger communities and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I am committed to working with conservatives in the name of the founding documents and building a more perfect union. My name is Dylan Ella Rothbein, musician, filmmaker, and I'm proud to walk away because the Democratic Party left me. I didn't leave the Democratic Party.